Plus, okay, I got a general announcement. I decided that I'll teach through the summer. So usually I take a sabbatical, but Tammy said she didn't have a lot for me to do this summer, so she's going to get me out of her hair. No, I'm just kidding. She said I should go ahead and teach, and that way maybe we'll get through with Hebrews. You know, this Hebrews thing is just, wow. You know, there's so much packed in every verse, and there's so much in it, so I don't know. I'm trying to move it along, but it's sometimes difficult. So we are in 11. And I got a couple of words a day for you. Look, we get to use a whole whiteboard here. Logisamenos. Okay. Logisamenos. Well, you know, this got to be logos. Yeah, logos, Lego. So from logos, which means an argument, right? We've had this word before. It's logizomai. Logizomai. So it means specifically to take an inventory. And what I think is interesting about this word, you know, we think of logos, right? We think of writing or reading or talking or an argument. You know, logos is translated almost everywhere as said. Say or said. Well, we know it's not say or said, it's a logical argument. That's what they're trying to tell us. But this word immediately throws the word logos, this form of the word logos, throws it into an inventory. So counting stuff, right? And we know that when Christ was on the cross, he goes, the word, we think of these words as meaning words about literary kind of things. But the actuality is the words aren't just about literary things. They're about geometrical and mathematical things. So this word meaning to take an inventory, I mean, you can see where they get it, right? Because, well, maybe you can't see how they get it. Logos is a logical argument. So if I move the logical argument into the sphere of business, what does that mean? I take an inventory. I have an inventory of my goods and stuff, my services, what I do and what I give. This is totally Greek, but it's totally foreign to us. We don't have any similar kind of words like that, right? We separate accounting and reading and mathematics and even, unfortunately, we separate mathematics from science sometimes. How does that work out, right? I mean, when I hear kids are learning science, I expect them to be learning how to do math conversions, mathematics, and balance chemical equations, but I don't think that's what they're getting. So, you see what I'm saying? Where in Greek, the Greeks would see this all together now. So, we have logos, a logical argument, and we have this making an inventory. So, every time we see the form of the word, and I also point out to you, remember tetelestai, right? Christ's last word on the cross, basically. It is finished, which doesn't mean it is finished. It means it's paid in full, literally. So, we have a logos to an unstated telos, and we have a logizomai to a tetelestai. We have an inventory to a paid in full. Wow. I mean, to me, that's just, if you can figure this out, you got the Greek thought all together. But I have problems with this. This is just, it's very interesting how their thinking falls into all these. Here's another word, melonton, melonton. Okay? I kind of thought we got the word mellow in English from this because the word specifically means, this word form means to attend. It's a verb, but it comes from a strengthened form of mellow, to be of interest to. And they say, i.e. to concern. In other words, something that concerns you. We'll see the context of this word, but the reason I kind of brought it out to you is this is not, well, both of these are kind of misconstrued. And what was really cool is I was given an article, and everyone asked me, why are the translations not as good as we think they should be, right? As we study the Greek, we see even the Hebrew, we see translations that we wouldn't like. And I thought this was a great quote. The author, this author is, in National Review, was reviewing a translation that someone had made. We don't usually call it a singular translation. A translation is usually only a translation in a biblical sense when it's done by a group. This was a singular translation. We usually call that a paraphrase, which is kind of interesting. They call it a translation. But anyway, the lady writes, let's see where the being. In this fragile vessel of conventional good taste, he navigates between the old ignorance, not too harsh a term, the King James is full of mistakes, which I think is kind of that's not a fair assumption. I think the NIV and the rest of them are full of mistakes too, to a degree. Current academic pedantry and the influence of religious doctrine over great stretches of time in making translations timid, stilted, and overly abstract. And I thought that's getting a little bit harsh, but that is really, really true.
It seems like what you always say, more or less.
Well, I try to say it in more judicious terms. I try to give them the benefit of the doubt because I don't think it's worthwhile for us to either tell people or say, don't read your translations, right? I think you should read your translations, and I think the King James is a pretty good compared to some. But this is really true. It's not that they translated and translated and translated, but yet what has happened is the academic pedantry, in other words, looking down their nose at you because you can't understand the way they can, right? I mean, I put it in simple terms. The influence of religious doctrine over great stretches of time in making translations timid, stilted, and overly abstract. And especially overly abstract. So that's what we're trying to do, which is what we always try to do, is look to see what the words say, see what it says within the context of the times, and then try to understand it. And so, I don't know, it seems like a good thing to do. I was thinking about how could you translate some of this stuff, easily. And there are Bibles. What's that one Bible? There's a Bible that actually tries to translate the words out, but sometimes the Amplified version. I've got a couple of those that are in parallel, but I still don't think they're quite as good as looking at the words themselves. In any case, thanks. That was
You're welcome.
She provided it to me, and I was looking through it. I thought, wow, that's really a little bit tough, a little bit more not candid, but a little tougher than I like to say it. I don't disagree with reading the translations. I just make that clear. In any case, so with these words, let's look at 18. We're up to 18. Now, where we have been, where we are, is we're talking about Abraham. So we've been talking about Abraham, and let's see, just before Abraham, the better country, and he offered up, we talked about offering up Isaac, and so we are at 18, and I'm certain that we hit the verses from the Old Testament and Maccabees. So, we're at 18, and here's the NIV. And I want to say, I disagree with, I'll say again, the King James is not bad. And the King James, for what it tries to do, is pretty good. I'm not going to say, I'm only going to do the King James because if it's good enough for Paul and Silas, it's good enough for me. I've actually had somebody quote that to me. But the King James, although it has, we see these little issues right through all these translations. And if you find one, the New English is pretty good, but if you find one that's better than others, point it out. I think they're all kind of cowardly in approaching some of this stuff. But anyway, 18. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So, I guess I should read 17. So 17, if you remember, here's the NIV. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. And we translated this as persuaded Abraham when tested, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. And he who had entertained as a guest the message of the gods bore towards him his only born. So now, even though this is a continuation of this phrase, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Okay, here's what it says in the Greek. Of, it's not of, it's pros. Pros means forward to. Forward to, pros. Whom, hos, that's good. It was said, lelo, to talk. So not Legos, but lelo. It's really interesting because usually when God says, it's always a Lego, right? This time it's a lelo, just to talk. That, hote, that's good. In, Isaac shall is added. They added Isaac shall. Thy, soy, to thee, seed, sperma, something sown, be called. Kaleo. The word is kaleo. So, here's the literal. Forward to whom uttered, that in Isaac to thee something sown be called. And so, what that's talking about is, remember if you look back at 17, the translation was persuaded Abraham when tested offered Isaac as a sacrifice, and he who had entertained as a guest the message of the gods bore towards him his only born. You can't understand this next phrase without that, because then it says, forward to whom uttered. Forward to whom uttered. In other words, forwarded to whom uttered, that through Isaac's seed, to thee he called. To thee he called. The calling, okay, who are they calling? Number one, okay, the Tin Hodos. Tin Hodos means the way. The way was called in the ecclesia. The ecclesia means the call, and it basically is the Athenian democracy. So when they called the Athenian democracy, they called it out, as opposed to the synagogue, which was led. So there's some chairs over that way. So the calling, who was called? Who was the forward to that was called? The forward to who was called was not Abraham. It wasn't Isaac.
It was the Messiah.
I think it's even closer to us than that. Who's it called? Tin Hodos. Right? Okay? So, the call, okay, it says that through Isaac's seed to thee he called. To Isaac's seed to thee he called.
Clarify kaleo just a little bit again. In ESV it says, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And we, in English, we have two meanings or more of the word called. Called can mean, I'm calling this boy Isaac, or call could be like to call out and say, hey, come here, or whatever. Which meaning is it most closely?
Kaleo in Greek means only to call out.
So it wouldn't exactly be, and the ESV is sort of mistranslated then by saying, through Isaac shall your offspring be named.
Yes, because they have got the wrong point. Okay, I'll go back. Remember at the beginning I told you, the first verse translated, but persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. So that's the logos. It's not really intro, but it's a logos set down for this whole chapter. The second one says, assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. In other words, the witness that we're talking about in all of this pithos, the pisteo, the condensed chapter, is about Tinodos. Every piece of this is about Tinodos. So therefore, okay, you would expect, all right, see if I can make this clear. This is not hard to make clear. I think that if the readers of this time would have gotten this like immediately, it's because we don't fully comprehend all the historical associations of this. Because here's Alexandria, and I contend that this was written to all the groups in Alexandria. And we're going to see even more evidence of that, which is going to be fun. But they came from the Galil. You had the school of Galil, you had the school of Alexandria, you had the school of Jerusalem, and then you had the Babylonian school. These are the Pharisaic schools, right? All of them are, okay, go back to the covenants. We have, I should probably go back to the beginning because it's always fun to see the covenants, but we have the Adamic covenant, okay, that was only to Adam. And then we have a second covenant that was to Adam and Eve that we really don't mention, but it's the one that specifically tells them what to do. But Eve never broke a covenant, just so you're clear. Adamic covenant said, don't eat of the tree, but Eve was not compelled to that. And that's what the Jews and Orthodox Jews believe. The third covenant was Noah. Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant is specific and covers everything except two things, which is the Sabbath, Shabbat, and the children obey your parents, which is really interesting. The fourth covenant was the covenant of Abraham. Abraham. The fifth covenant was the covenant of Moses. I'm not sure I agree, but I will put the sixth covenant. The sixth covenant is considered you can say there was a Davidic covenant, but the Davidic covenant really wasn't to all of us. It was to David, right? They usually don't count that. But sometimes people say there's a sixth covenant, and that sixth covenant is the new covenant. The new covenant, right? And we've seen some evidence of that. But I'm not so sure about this new covenant. The Mosaic covenant was supposed to be end-all covenant, right? And that we're all covered then through Christ. Now, if you want to call that a new covenant, I'll go for that. But that's, kind of whatever. But the big deal is, okay, the calling of Isaac, or the calling through, it says specifically, for to whom uttered, that through Isaac's seed to thee he called. Isaac's seed. So, this covenant was to all humans, right? This covenant was to all, this covenant was to men. This covenant was to men and women, so women created as the peak of creation. This one was to all people. The Abrahamic covenant was to the children of Abraham, right? And to Abraham, which included Isaac and then later on Israel. But who else were children of Abraham?
All who by faith believe.
Yeah.
And he said all nations will be blessed through you, so.
And was Abraham a child of Israel?
No.
He was a
Chaldean.
huh?
A Chaldean, right?
Yeah. He wasn't a Jew. Like, we conceive of Jews. You gotta be a Jew. You gotta be, right? Mosaic covenant.
He was the first time we hear the term Hebrew.
Right. And was he circumcised?
No.
Not yet.
No. Eventually, right? Right? So he wasn't circumcised on the seventh day. Was his mother Jewish?
No.
Oh no. So when we say forward the call of Isaac, who is being called? Do you see this? Why the author said this? It didn't say that God said this as a Legos. It said it was uttered. Which the point being, okay, he's writing to people who are Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, Hebrews. And what would they consider themselves to be? Are they children of Israel? No, they're Gentiles. Right? This goes back to what we talked about before. Remember the promise? Noah was a Gentile. Abraham was a Gentile. And so if I promise you, if I give you the call came to each of these. And the really important thing to these people is the call came to Gentiles. Right? Because that means they're
Covered.
They're covered, they're included, like usins, right? This is and this is the question of this entire book. The question of Hebrews is, remember when we talked about Romans, the question in Romans was, does this God apply? Right? In this case, the people are asking, well, does this apply to me? Does this count? Does it count for me? I'm an Egyptian. You know, does this count? I'm a Roman. Does this work for me? I'm a Greek. And guess what the authors are telling us? In more ways than one, right? Because Abraham was convinced, then the call came to Isaac's seed. Oh, I'm Isaac's seed. I'm not covered by the Mosaic covenant. We're actually under the Noahic covenant, right? And so was Abraham. So, the promises, now, who are the promises coming to? Everyone. Right, exactly. This is what's beautiful about this. So the calling to teen notice was through the seed of Isaac. Here's what Genesis, I don't know if I put the references to this, is Genesis 21:12. And let's see, yeah, I can read this first part. In 1, now the Lord was gracious, Yahweh was gracious to Sarah as he said. And Yahweh did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, Sarah bore him. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw her son, whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Be reckoned. And I will make a son, a maidservant, etc. It will be a nation also, because he is your offspring. So and so and so. Now let's see, there's another reference, I believe. Or is that the only reference to this? Yeah, I think it's the only reference to this. The point, this is where this allusion is in the scripture, because it's not a direct quote, right? And in 12, is it 2 again? It's not uttered, it's God Lego, which is interesting too. 19. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Okay, let's see what this says, because I'm not sure this is exactly what it says. We'll see. Here's 19. Accounting. Logizomai. To take in inventory. That, pote, that is good. God, theos, is added. Literally powerful. Capable. That's dynamos. To raise him up. Egerio. Even, kai, and from ek, thee is added, necros. From whence Hotan, from which place also, and he received komizo, to provide for. He provide for him, autos, himself, in parabola. Parabola. So, this is really interesting. The word parable is in here. And remember, parable, I didn't give you this word day, we've had the word day before. A parable is a near throw, right? It's a logos to telos with how many? One telos. It's a logos to an unstated telos with a singular telos. So a parabola, right, crosses the axis one time in the Greek worldview. But I don't see that anywhere in my NIV. Now I see it in the King James. They left it in. Let's see what it says literally. Literally, to take an inventory that God, powerful, capable to waken, and from dead, from which place, and he provided for himself in a parable, a logos with a single telos. So a translation of this is reason by data that God was capable to waken, and from death and from which place he provided for himself in a parable. He provided for himself in a parable. Now, the NIV tells us Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. The translation, and this is from the Greek, is reason by data that God was, in other words, God reasoned by data, I could probably put it that way. God reasoned by data was capable to waken and from death, and from which place he provided for himself in a parable. Who's the himself? Who's the noun in this sentence?
Jesus.
Well, God or Jesus, right? There's no Abraham in this statement at all. It doesn't. In the Greek, it doesn't say anything about Abraham at all. It says everything about God. So the autos, the himself, wasn't Abraham. The autos and the subject of the whole phrase is God. Because, let me ask you this. Do you think that Abraham in any way reasoned that God could or would raise someone from the dead?
Well, if they didn't have a word for it, then.
I would argue that's an easy proof, and you're right on. But, okay, in the ancient world, all right, look, go back and you can challenge every one of your professors. If they tell you this, tell them, show me the money. Show me the proof. There is no story of anyone coming back from death in any myth cycle, any myth, or any God story until after Jesus Christ. If you remember what happened to the famous Osiris, what happened to the Egyptian god?
Got cut up in pieces and spread around.
Did he come back?
No, one piece was lost.
He's still missing one piece, his piece, the important piece, and he is not coming back until they find the piece. As a matter of fact, he's depicted with a wooden piece. You know, it's funny how, you know, and this goes back to this little story here. We, we overly abstract. Stilted, timid, and overly abstract. Because if we really put this into context, people would really want to read the Bible all the time, because there's all kinds of really fun stuff in here. You know, there really is deep stuff to understand. How about, remember Psyche? Who was it? The guy who tried to bring, it starts with Orpheus. Orpheus and Eurydice. Yeah, he tried to bring her back from, his girlfriend back from Hades.
What about Persephone was taken to Hades by, I can't remember who, and she comes back for like half a year and goes back, and that's how we have the seasons.
But she did not.
Because she was...
Didn't die, okay.
She was what?
Taken, kidnapped?
No, she's not even a demigod. She's a real goddess. She was a daughter of Demeter. She was a god. She was the daughter of Demeter and a goddess, so therefore immortal. Right? In the Greek worldview, there are gods, demigods, and creatures, hagios, hagios creatures, right? Hagios, horrific creatures. So, in the Greek worldview, demigods can die. There was one god who died. Pan died. Pan died after the death of Christ. You see, after the death of Christ, his resurrection, there's a whole bunch of magical resurrection mysterions that suddenly occur. Yes, ma'am?
But, no, this was after Abraham, but God did raise people from the dead in the Old Testament. You know, there was Elijah, raised the widow's son, and there were several. So it's not that...
No, one. When there's one, it's the son. The widow's son, that Elijah, and the problem is... Elijah.
Well, they both did. Elijah raised the widow's son, and Elisha the Shunammite woman's son, I think.
I don't remember that one, but when you look at what it says, there's a couple of... Okay. Do you remember when the reason when Jesus, who is God, raised some people from the dead, right?
Right.
When he did, there was some really interesting things going on with it. Number one, in one case, there was actually a funeral, and they were carrying him.
That's right.
Which means that what happened? He was declared dead,
Right.
right? There was also the case of the young girl, right? And Jesus told them, don't say anything about it. Part of the reason he said don't say anything about it, although we see evidence that God, Jesus, raised people from the dead. In the other cases, when we look at the Hebrews is not as clear as it is to us in our translation. Right? Because in the Hebrews, it says, for example, the words for death and dead are not exactly, and I dug them up, we're not like, if we looked at them, go look at them yourself and see. See if it's ambivalent. Because remember, was there a funeral for either of those young gentlemen? Were they buried in the ground? Did someone assert that they had died? The thing was that what it says is they lost nefesh. They lost their breath. And then in the one case, I remember specifically when Elijah, the first one, raised the widow's son, it says he laid on him and gave him breath. Right? Nefesh. So we would have said that's artificial respiration, or that somehow his pressure on his body may have brought him back to life.
In
right?
the Elisha and the Shunammite woman's son, she went to him in bitter distress and said, did I not ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Like, she totally believed that her son was dead because she was really mad that she got the son and now he was taken away. And then it said, Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life.
Well, nefesh. When they say that, sound or sign of life, okay, to them it's nefesh.
And then it says when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed.
Right? Yes, and? Okay, so if you fall over here and you stop breathing, are you dead?
For how long? Because he was lying
For how long,
there for
exactly.
quite a while as she went to travel to go get Elisha. And so.
Well, okay, I'm just saying, it's very ambivalent, especially in the old period, because when you're dead, you're technically dead after 48 hours. All your cells are dead, okay, cellular dead. But if someone falls over right here, you're going to say, go get the AED, hey, why don't you do some artificial, respiration, and we might be able to bring it back. And even if we couldn't bring it back, if you're young, what's the chance you might come back? Or let's say you're choking and you stop breathing. Are you dead? Now, You notice what it says. The breath was not in him. If you stop breathing in that culture, the nefesh was gone. What does it say?
Okay, Hebrews 11:35, so we're gonna get to it soon.
Yeah.
It says, women received back their dead by resurrection.
Ah, but that's after Hebrews. Or what are you talking about? In the
Oh, okay,
context
so-
of...
He says, for what more shall I say, for the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson. So he's talking about all these Old Testament people and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms and enforced justice, so on, and quenched the power of fire, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, some were tortured, blah, blah, blah. So he's
Because
talking about all the Old Testament.
Because what happened is, after Christ, then what happens? After Christ, what happened?
Resurrection.
We can talk about it, right? Before Christ, it's ambivalent. Before Christ, it's ambivalent. And it's still, I would argue,
Isn't he confirming that Elisha and Elijah did bring them back to life?
this is the proof text. For example, I have a friend that says, isn't the proof text of Christ saying things about the Old Testament a proof text of the Old Testament? To a degree it is, but to a degree it's not. Because a book a book document has to prove itself. What we're doing is we're now proof texting something. What do you call it? It's like quarterbacking after the game, right? The reason that we say there was no resurrection is because we have no proof text of resurrection. It's no, until you get to Jesus. And in Jesus, you have a proof text of resurrection. This is what makes it so different. Now, the rest of the world would like to say two things. What does the rest of the world like to say? Yes, sir.
I have a question on that.
Okay.
You can be persuaded without even seeing the proof, according to what you're telling us. So I don't need the proof to accept that Elijah or Elisha did what he did. So the scripture itself says that, and I don't need to say, like, for example, maybe he didn't have breath because of this and that, but if it says clearly there, then I'll go to exactly what the scripture is saying. So I don't need a proof to say that, okay, because of this might happen.
What I want to do is make you understand, or have you understand, the recognition of the ideas that we have today and where they come from, and the ideas and the way people view the world in the past. How much money is in the Old Testament? None. Zero. There's no money. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. My point is, like, for example, it's on those days, okay? Like Elijah and Elisha.
Right.
To me, it looks like it was just like, it's like something like a setup for what was to come. Like, for example, there's something like a resurrection.
Yes.
But people you may be pronounced dead, but you will come to life.
I would say that's precisely, you're nibbling at exactly the point. Before this, I don't have proof, right? But I have the idea. Well, the idea. The Egyptians had the idea, right? Osiris, what a cool idea. But he didn't come back. They had the idea, whatever, the Greek myth, right? Psyche and Eurydice, whatever. They're coming back.
Orpheus and Eurydice.
Orpheus and Eurydice. I try to remember these things. I need to write my notes, right? But anyway, they had the idea. The idea was, wouldn't it be cool if someone could come back from death? But they didn't, right? In Elijah, we have a different thing. We have an account, right, written by men about historical revelation of God, which is, I think, very important to us. In retrospect, we look back. Now, what I would want to know is, what words did the rabbis use? Right? And if we studied this in Hebrew, I'm certain you would find that the words used are not death. Matter of fact, Hebrew has problems with the word death anyway.
I would like to know what word in Hebrew then it says, when it's talking about the Elijah one.
Right.
O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?
Right.
So that seems pretty clear in English, but.
But it's not, because the word killing, there is only one word in Hebrew for killing. It's the same word for striking. Remember I told you this before? When it says, thou shalt not kill, that's not what it says. It says, thou shalt not strike. The word strike means to hit with the intent of harm. So, this really puts into context some of the things that Jesus said about, being struck on the face, la, 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 la. The problem is between Greek and Hebrew. There is no word in Hebrew. The word in Hebrew for kill is the word strike. And that's because they are very abstract. They are very euphemistic in their language terms. So when it says in Isaiah and Elijah, because this is what I'm trying to tell you, if you translated that back, let's say 1,000 years ago, you would have probably written that his breath stopped. And then Elijah restarted his breath, brought back nefesh. However, in retrospect today, in Monday morning quarterbacking, right? Because we know that someone can be resurrected from death, can be egerio ek nekros, just as it says here, then what do we say?
They were dead and brought back to life.
They were dead and brought back to life.
So maybe the Septuagint would, the Greek words that were chosen would show what the Jewish people thought several centuries before Christ.
Precisely. And that, what's interesting too is remember, that would also be the apocryphal period. And in the apocryphal period, they were looking forward to a Messiah who wouldn't die, who would be immortal and, forever, right? But they never conceived of a Messiah who would die and come back from death. So I think but the point of this specific verse, I think the most important thing about this verse is there is no Abraham in this verse. There is only God in this verse. And the point of the verse is, God reasoned by data was capable to waken from death, and from which place he provided for himself in a parable. Right? Isaac was a parable. Elijah and Elisha were parables. Right? Pointing to what would happen. Now, if you told them that, however many years later, 500 something years later, that God would raise someone, actually God would raise God from the dead, what would you say? You're nuts. Number one, why would he do that? Number two, you're nuts. Number three, why would he do that? You see what I'm saying? And how could he do that? They say, how could you do that? Because it's never happened in the history of the world. All these myth cycles, all these groups had these myths, but they never came back. Everyone who was dead is dead. As a matter of fact, if you go look, and you'll find in every ancient myth cycle, according to their myth, is it possible to come back from the place of the dead? In Japanese myth cycle, which is probably the latest myth cycle we have, it was impossible for gods to come back from the place of the dead. The gods themselves, if they went to death, could not come back. And by the way, what happened to Persephone?
She
Right?
had to keep going back. She couldn't stay out of Hades forever.
What's really funny is that almost every myth cycle says that if you eat something that's from the place of the dead, you can't leave. And that's in the Persephone myth, right? She ate of the pomegranate and got stuck. So I don't know. The most important thing here is, what I think is really important, is the sacrifice of Isaac, in retrospect, was God's parable, not Abraham. It wasn't a parable to Abraham. Abraham had no clue. Abraham was just going about his business. I'm going to sacrifice Isaac. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I really don't quite agree with you, I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
Because this is talking about the faith that was a gift to these ancient people. And Abraham trusted God because he had a promise that his seed would be uncountable. Okay? And then God told him to sacrifice his son. And I think that he was convinced that God was going to keep that promise. And if it was going to be from Isaac, the miracle baby that was born in his very old age, and his wife was very old and was able to nurse that child, he had to believe that something was going to happen. And God blessed him with this, told him, okay, I'm impressed. I know now that you love me because you're willing to give up your son, your only son, and then you provided the lamb, or the ram in the bushes. But I think that Abraham trusted God, that he was willing to kill his only son, and still that God would keep that promise.
That's good. What I'm trying to do is show you in the Greek how that the words in the Greek don't match the translation that we have. And the translation we have actually takes out of context. It wasn't important that Abraham, to the people here, Teen Hodos, it's not important. Abraham's not what's important. What's important? Abraham's what?
Christ.
Christ. Yeah. The focus isn't Abraham. Abraham was convinced, and therefore he did what God told him to do.
Right.
But the ultimate wasn't Abraham. The ultimate was Christ and God. And so what the author is intentionally trying to do, which I think that the translators misconstrued to us, the author is consistently trying to point us back to verse 2. Verse 2 is, assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. So therefore, it wasn't Abraham's witness of Isaac. The most important thing was their witness of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's what made the difference. So, yes, Abraham was convinced, but you know what? It could have been that God would provide another heir through Sarah. Maybe he was thinking, there's lots of other solutions that I could provide. Maybe, I don't know, we know what happened. Angel came down, or, basically God came down and said, stop, and here's your sacrifice. But, that doesn't take away from his willingness or his convincing. Yes,
I think we have a tendency to view everything in the shadow of the cross.
yes, we do.
Because, and Bible Study Fellowship teaches it exactly the way you described it, that Abraham believed that Isaac would be resurrected. But I think we're viewing it in the shadow of the cross. We know that Christ was raised from the dead after he was in the grave for 48 hours. And my translation, this is a Revised Standard, and in the Genesis story, it says God will provide himself the sacrifice. So the way I read that is completely, it's a foreshadowing of the coming of Jesus.
Right.
Well, this whole story is a foreshadowing of Jesus.
Her point is that they're talking about the faith of these people.
No, the convincing. But that's,
Okay,
sorry.
well,
Sorry.
okay, that's the English word, sorry.
That's all
Right.
right.
But to me, it's like, who would be taking an inventory or reckoning from data that God was able? Wouldn't that be Abraham?
No. reason by data that God, okay, God was reasoning, not Abraham necessarily, that God was capable, because the quote before is in 18. Let's see, back to 18. Even though God had said to him, just do Isaac, okay, the translation, for to whom uttered, that through Isaac's seed to thee he called. Ford to whom uttered. Okay? And the uttering was, obviously, the uttering was not Abraham. The uttering was God, right? God came to him. In the previous one we saw it directly, the direct analogy was the people, the guests that came to his place and predicted that his son, right, that he would do this. And then it says, for to whom uttered, that through Isaac's seed to thee he called. And then it goes directly to 19. And 19 says nothing about Abraham. Abraham's not in there at all. It's reason by data that God was capable to waken and from death, and from which place he provided for himself in a parable. So the parable was to us, to King Hodos, in retrospect. I think, like I said, this whole thing is about how, to us, it accounts. This is not an account of the faith of people in the past. This is not an account of it is not an account that says they were fixed because of it. The account is that because of Jesus Christ, all of these people are saved, and all of us'ns are saved. Do you see this point? We read this and we want to say, oh, this is a good example because these people were willing to do these things.
Well, I know we've been taught that our whole Sunday school life.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. So this is a hard mental shift that you're trying to get us to go to.
It is about it's about the message to us. It's not about the people in the past are used as examples, right? As parables. And they were convinced, and therefore because they were convinced, what should we be? Convinced. Right? Convinced even to death. Convinced even to sacrificing, our children. Or, doing what we need to do. And by the way, this time they were, right? They were dying. The Romans were killing them because of their faith. And later on, it's going to get worse. I mean, these words were to the people then and to help them. And therefore, I would argue that they are words that are for us, right? To both convince us and to assure us. So that would be homework. I'm sorry, that was theological. We're not supposed to be doing theology. We're supposed to be doing what does it say, right, historically. But the focus of the history is not on the examples, but on Christ, Jesus Christ. That's the most important thing in history. So, yeah, you see what happens, though. You know why we got to where Tammy mentioned it in all our Sunday school and all of our teaching, why do we do that? Yes?
Yeah, maybe because of the translation that we have now, you're giving us new revelation on new translations. That's why we're trying to,
Part of it is a translation, you're right on. But the other part of it is that if you look at this from a Roman or an English standpoint, you want intro, body, conclusion. And intro, body, conclusion tells you that who's the focus? The people, right? But if you're looking at it in a Greek logos to telos, the focus isn't the people. The logos to telos is to proof text of Christ. I'm telling you the telos right out. Oh, I'm sorry. But that's the telos. And so the logos, all the logos is there to do what? Persuade and prove the telos.
Is part of this difficulty that a lot of the times the actual subject or the name is not actually in the text? Like in verse 18 you said there's no Isaac in the text, and then
there's no Abraham in 19, so you have to really.
There is an Isaac, sorry, there is an Isaac in that text, but there is no,
Oh, okay.
there was a was added or
Okay.
something, sorry.
Okay, something else, but anyway, some of the other times, there's not necessarily that person's name or whatever, so you have to figure out who is the Greek actually, because there are a lot of pronouns, and same in the Hebrew and the Old Testament, I think, there's a lot of pronouns, and you have to figure out to whom do they actually refer.
Well, and see, if I'm translating, okay, this is where I get to the thing, and this is where I kind of get irritated about some of our translators. Our translators are trying to make it clear to usins,
Right.
and we are English speakers, and a lot of the stuff came, they're copying Latin, but they're not translating from Latin. They just want to copy what is in, they want to copy what you've heard forever, right? So when I translate something, especially, let's say the Abraham is the focus of that phrase. My assumption as an English speaker is, who's going to continue until the end of the phrase? Abraham. But that's not true in Greek, and that's not always true in other stuff. And we can see how suddenly from Abraham, the subject goes to God. And to me, as a reader, I'm like, whoa, God, right? Because if the focus is God, then the authors are telling us something about God, or their understanding of God, right? So I'm saying? But if the focus is about Abraham, I mean, okay, I love Abraham, but, Abraham had issues. Why do I care about Abraham? You see what I'm saying?
But why would God reckon that he was able to raise him up from the dead when that wasn't the plan? His plan was not to have Isaac killed and have him raised up.
Because it was a parable. So the reckoning is, if you take it that Abraham reckoned, Abraham reasoned by data, right? The data was that God would provide some solution. But he didn't know there would be resurrection. Resurrection is like, matter of fact, Elijah and Elisha hadn't even happened yet.
I know, that's why I said it was after.
Yes, sir.
So here's in my Revised Standard, in Genesis 22:8, Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering of my son. So in my margin notes, I have Isaiah 53:10, where it says, when he makes himself an offering for sin. So to me, it's clear that it was always about a foreshadowing of Jesus.
I would say so too. The problem we have, and this is what I always want to tell you guys, right? To us, when we read the Old Testament, we read the Old Testament within the context of Christ in our understanding.
It's like we've got the answer.
We do. We know God's plan. Well, actually, we don't know all of God's plan, but we know God's plan up to now, right? God's plan was Christ. But did we know that? The Old Testament people didn't know that. They were getting bits and pieces. Finally, in the Apocryphal period, which makes me irritated we don't teach the Apocrypha enough, because in the Apocryphal period, they started getting this Greek thinking. And the Greek thinking, they started thinking about the Old Testament. And when you read the Old Testament, you get this image that, what does it mean when God said he's going to provide a sacrifice? And what does it mean that there's no sacrifice for intentional sin? And what does it mean? You see, the Hebrews never thought about that. Why? Well, they thought about it and knew about it, but why did it not bother them?
They weren't Greek rationalists? Is that what you're trying to get at?
They were not Greek rationalists. Greek rationalism is an entirely different way of looking at the world. They had no idea what was going on. When you start reading Greek rationalism and you begin to understand how things are working, now you ask these questions. That's what the Apocryphal documents did. And then we get to the New Testament. And slam, right? All of a sudden, we know, right? The evidence is like beyond a shadow of doubt. Anyway, this is a good discussion. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cause consternation, but I think it's important to recognize always the focus of Christ in Hebrews especially. Thank you, God, for your word. We pray you look at this week. In your name we pray, amen. And I may be out of the picture for half the show.